So I've got a short presentation to talk about documentary and to introduce some of the areas of research that I've looked at for my PhD. This is a tiny, tiny part of my PhD. It's hopefully the part that's the most illustrative of the research that I've done, and hopefully will be of interest to you. If there's any questions, by all means, chip in at any time. There'll be some time at the end for questions if not. But I'd also be interested in your experiences of some of the films I'm going to talk about, of this period as well, because it might be that you're familiar with the films I'm going to talk about, or some of the directors I'm going to talk about. And by all means, yeah, chip in with whatever views, experiences you've got of whatever these topics are that I'm going to cover. I've titled this kind of screen documentary in the digital age as a means of kind of locating this kind of roughly in the early part of the 21st century. Because what I'm loosely positing, you'll see within this presentation, is that something happened, something of significance happened within cinematic documentary. Now, you might not have done any film studies before, you might be a fan of cinema, but either way, you'll probably have some notion of film as being divided into genres, different types. You might be familiar with westerns, you might be familiar with horror or thriller, and I'm going to talk about documentary as being a genre of contemporary cinema. So you might think of documentary in various different ways, but I'm going to think of it cinematically. Although I'm interested in documentary in the digital age, I guess my story begins much sooner. Anyone tell me what the clip is? That is Indiana Jones. Good shout. Raiders of the Lost Ark is kind of where I would say for me, if I had to pinpoint the moment I became a film fan, it would be watching that film. And what happened within my interest of film is that kind of expanded. It kind of grew to then include the subjects I'm going to be exploring today. And my interest, I suppose, in documentary occurred around 2004, something like that. I got a real sense of the fact that something was happening around this time. So as a film fan, I was going to the cinema lots in, watching those cheesy blockbusters and kind of getting interested in kind of independent film around this time and international film around this time. So going to the cinema enough to kind of feel like I was witnessing something different, something was changing around 2004. And what we got around this period were these new types of films which didn't have special effects, they didn't have makeup, they didn't have scripts, and they didn't have actors. And what they had in common was this close relationship with real life. Now, of course, there are lots of films which are inspired by real life events. I'm going to talk about cinematic documentaries as being a distinction from those. So around 2004, I kind of get a sense that something's happening. And I guess with a bit of reluctance, because I was quite set in my cinematic ways, I was invited to watch Spellbound at the cinema. And it was the first time I'd ever encountered a feature-length documentary in a cinema. I kind of liked cinema for its kind of escapist appeal, or for the stories, or for the characters. And it felt like documentary, prior to this study at least, documentary was for television, documentary was for wildlife shows, documentary was for historical, archival purposes. Never thought of it as a means of cinematic entertainment until I saw Spellbound. And what I got actually was a real kind of awakening. So in many ways, this research is quite indebted to this film. I'd hoped that this clip would activate when I clicked it. It won't, I'm afraid, so I'm going to have to zip down here. And I'm going to show you the trailer to Spellbound. And it's very short, but that's not the trailer to Spellbound. But what it gives you is a nice little snapshot of the kind of things that are covered. And what I really liked about Spellbound was how it was structured in such an engaging and such a compelling and a very cinematic way. So hopefully the sound will work in here. And I'll show you the short trailer. If you're not familiar with it, the trailer will be fairly self-explanatory really. It's an American film. And it looks as this phenomenon of spelling bees, which, again, growing up in England is not really something I'm massively familiar with. But you'll get the gist of it from this trailer if the sound works.
Harry, turn toward the microphone and let's finish the word, please.
Okay, then. Let's see, what do I got so far? T-P-I-T-H-E-T.
Here's another one. Look, I can't even pronounce these words.
Painter.
You can know every single word in the round but one. It's that one.
Chateaubriand.
We went on for I think 11 or 12 rounds.
Well, I got on stethoscope.
Hour one, city last Friday, now I'm going to the bishops.
My baby!
My baby gonna win.
My heart was pounding. You can't not be nervous. My hands are clammy.
Oh, it's more intense than any competition.
S-T-S-S.
This one letter, and you're out.
Cephalalgia.
Cephalalgia?
A pain in the head. Nephalognacy.
Dysphagia.
Hellebore. Palimpsest.
Neil's grandfather in India has paid 1,000 people to be chanting and praying for Neil to win.
Darjeeling.
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 Can you pronounce the word again, please?
I felt bad for the boy who was from Texas and got Yenta.
Yenta.
Oh, I want to get a word. I actually remember. Oh my gosh, am I right? Am I right? I-N-E.
That is correct.
You've done 4,000 words and you got one mistake. You're doing good now.
You don't get any second chances in India the way you do in America.
They thought we would have better opportunities. They're just so proud.
My life is like a movie. I go through different trials and tribulations, and then I finally overcome.
So I saw Spellbound, and if you're familiar with the film, you'll know that the end is as electrifying as any cinema film you'll see. It's as exciting as any car chase. The characters are as well-rounded and as likeable as any work of drama fiction that you'll watch. So it was enlightening, and it was kind of typical of the types of films that I noticed were being released around kind of 2004. What you might have got a sense of then was that it's highly character driven, kind of focuses on these 8 individuals that have this brilliant nationwide spread across the US, a range of different backgrounds, people from quite rich families, people from quite deprived backgrounds as well, all competing in the same competition. The trailer kind of hints at notions of the American dream, this idea that if you strive, if you work hard enough, you can achieve, which is very cinematic in itself. The American dream is in many ways a cinematic construct. So that was my introduction to cinematic documentary, and completely converted. And if I haven't just closed it down, I went to see a British film. Released during the same period by a Scottish director called Kevin MacDonald, and it's called Touching the Void. And there are a number of films which, if you like, kind of opened the floodgates for this. What I'm going to talk about, this sort of new wave of documentaries. Most of them are American, but Touching the Void probably being one of the most important British films released at this time. Unlike Spellbound, which is filmed there and then, in situ, recording events as they take place, Touching the Void concerns a mountaineering, an expedition, tragic expedition that took place in the early 1980s. So it's been told retrospectively by those involved, and it won huge plaudits. It became the highest grossing documentary ever released in British cinemas, and what it didn't have was any footage of the incident itself. It involved a climbing expedition in South America, 2 British climbers on their own first to summit Suv Le Grand when something went wrong. So there's no footage of the incident itself. There's no archival footage. There are no photographs even included within this. But what Kevin MacDonald does, quite untraditionally for the documentary genre, is that he recreates the footage, directs it, scripts it, casts actors, finds costumes, uses the same equipment that was used. And I'll play the trailer so you'll get a sense. This is even shorter, this one, but you'll get a sense of the film. And I'd be interested to hear from you. You'll see, you know, obviously like any trailer, it's a compressed version of the overall film. See whether you can kind of think about what I think's missing from this trailer. What is an audience never told at any point?
We knew a number of expeditions had failed on it, so we knew it was hard.
At some point, you're going to have to rely wholly on your partner.
I didn't really know what I was letting myself in for.
We just lost control.
I just felt it was best to get as far away as possible.
I was just convinced he was dead. As soon as I saw it, I knew it had been cut. I thought, this is it. This is as far as this game goes.
There you go, so it's a shorter trailer, but it kind of encapsulates the film quite well. Any idea what's missing from that? We're given a lot of information. The ending's definitely missing, yeah, but we might expect a trailer to be a bit more ambiguous, mightn't we, to kind of, to load the premise and then to leave the audience wanting more. Mina, what are you thinking?
It's not actually saying that the footage are not archived.
That's very true. No, it doesn't. No, it never stipulates. Often when footage is recreated on television, it might say with a closed caption. On that particular note, ultimately, what aren't we told? Do you get a kind of... Never. At any point does it say it's a documentary. And the reason this is such a good example is because not only are we talking about something that's structured, that's conceived to feel like a thriller, but it's actually been marketed in the same way as well. And often genre films, and this is a genre film, just that of the documentary genre, it might refer to it as a gripping thriller. It might refer to it as a chilling horror film. Films often in their marketing refer to the genre, refer to where they see themselves in wider cinema. But it doesn't. It feels perhaps a bit more like a thriller. The use of music, the use of editing, the recreated footage. We don't see any of the interviews with those involved. We hear the voiceover. So there's absolutely nothing to suggest there that we're not watching complete work of fiction. It says based on a true story. It says based on the bestseller. But otherwise, it feels very much like any other Hollywood film. Big landscapes, close-ups of the knife going through the rope, some dramatic sound bites which have been taken. So you might very well go along and watch this film and be completely unbeknown to you that you're watching a documentary. And that it was the start of a trend of a type of documentary which were being created, marketed, and also kind of like screened alongside wider fictional cinema. And what we got at this time was a real kind of blurring between when documentary ends and when fictional film starts. Touching the Void's a tricky one. It mostly comprises of interviews with 3 people involved, the 2 climbers and their friend that stayed at base camp. Head and shoulders, traditional documentary style. They're recounting it, almost a kind of a campfire story, this near tragic event which took place. But it's supplemented by the additional footage. And it's hard to know to what extent this is a documentary that's supported by recreated footage or a film that's heavily indebted to real life events. It becomes harder and harder to tell. So I'm interested in documentary, and I begin this PhD, and I go, I go back to this period because it felt like it was, anecdotally certainly it felt like it was a period of significance. Of course, this being a PhD, this being academia, it was not simply a case of talking about documentary. And part of my research tried to get to the roots of documentary, really, to kind of ascertain what it is, what the audience expectations of it might be. It is a genre after all. Genre is often quite difficult to define. You could probably quite convincingly argue that Star Wars is a Western, if we looked at the iconography, if we looked at the characters, yet it takes place in space. We might argue that Alien is a horror film, but it has a science fiction location. So the premises of genre are not set, and they're often a negotiation between the film, the filmmaker, and the audience. Audiences bring an expectation of what's required, but the filmmaker can push back at those if they want to as well. And that's what we got during this period. Some documentaries which kind of challenge what we might typically think of. Typically, well, we could think of documentary as a type of photography, a genre, if you like, of photography. We'd recognise it, of course, as a form of radio or of television. And I'm sure if you ask the layperson what is a documentary, they might immediately go to television as their reference point. You might think of documentary theatre, not something I was aware of before I began this research, taking actual verbatim conversations recorded in time and place of significance and recreated on the stage. So we can think of documentary as kind of existing in various different kind of creative forms. For the sake of my research, of course, I was interested in documentary as a form of cinema. So let's try and get to the roots of that. And cinema, the birth of cinema, 1895, has a reasonably short history, actually, compared to other kind of creative outlets. A nice quote here to talk about, depending on how one defines documentary, it could be said to be associated with the birth of film itself, because the first ever exhibited forms of film were real life events. They were obviously the famous train pulling into station, the factory workers leaving at the end of the day. There were no actors, no scripts. There was nothing fictional about them. So if we take a very kind of obvious description of documentary as it being the depiction of real life, well, the very, very first moving image might be grounded. Rather than documentary being a form of film, in many ways it might be film. And rather than it becoming fictionalised and then non-fictionalised later, perhaps it was the other way around. So we might think of documentary as going right back to the very birth of film itself. Academics like to be more precise, of course, and the first ever use of the word documentary, recorded use of the word documentary in an American publication, the New York Sun, related to this film. And it was by a filmmaker called Robert Flatt, a brilliant kind of adventurer, filmmaker, who would go off and spend his time in these remote parts of the world. And this was a film that was shot in the South Pacific. And it looked at village life. It looked at everyday life in this particular part of the world. Moana was not Robert Flatt's first film. He'd produced a film in 1922 called Nanak of the North, where he'd gone to the other side of the world, gone up inside northern Canada, inside the Arctic Circle, and filmed Eskimo Inuit communities there. He'd now gone and took this kind of almost anthropological, but with a video camera, study to the South Pacific. And it was in a review of Moana that this chap, highly influential British documentarian John Grierson, it was in his review that he referred to Moana as having documentary value. The first recorded use of the term. John Grierson today is regarded as the grandfather of documentary. He was a prolific documentary producer. Actually only directed 2 films himself. He headed a brilliantly sounding organisation called the Empire Marketing Board, and the Empire Marketing Board would make films about the British Empire as a means of kind of promoting trade or good practice, or just kind of capturing cultural quirks within the British Empire. Grierson was the producer of lots of these, so highly influential as a filmmaker, but also as a critic in coining this term, documentary value. Later on, he described documentary, he coined the term after all, as being the creative treatment of actuality. And that's about as rock solid a definition as you'll get today, I think, the creative treatment of actuality. And it tells you everything you really need to know. Of course, documentary needs to be bound in real life. What constitutes actuality, of course, is a whole different, perhaps more philosophical discussion than we've got time for today. But this kind of creative treatment, touching the void, recreating footage, spellbound, constructing this kind of almost episodic approach, ending on a thriller like a Rocky film, something like that. The creative treatment of actuality. And that's quite a well-used kind of industry notion of documentary. Academically, however, obviously creates a few more problems, because academics like to delve a little deeper. We might crudely think of documentary as being the subject, the recording of an event or an incident, a person or place, a viewpoint perhaps, told journalistically. That might be something that's familiar to most of us here in the Centre for Journalism, or as a one-sided polemical argument. Some theorists have sought to clarify the issue. Documentary might be considered a movie about real life. That's about as clear-cut a definition as you might hope from an academic. However, notions of real life have haunted documentary since its early days. The much cited documentary theorist Bill Nichols, American film critic, said, I don't know whether this is a kind of a defeatist approach or whether he's just seen enough documentaries to know that it's just not worth the bother. But they can no more easily be defined than love or culture. So here I am trying to make sense of a genre which can't be defined, and in a particular period which in itself has its own complications. So if I relocate my study to 2002, 3, 4, when I first became interested in it, lots of people referring back to this point as being a golden age. This is a British documentary maker called Lucy Walker. She's released a number of cinematic documentaries. This golden age for documentary filmmaking, she told The Guardian. You might be familiar with a film that Steve James made, an American documentary called Hoop Dreams. Came out in 1996. I sincerely believe we live in a golden age of documentary. So there was I felt like a sort of real reinforcement of the sense that I had that something of significance was taking place. These are filmmakers referring to this same period, so kind of retrospectively. Academically, Maxine Baker says, I believe we're living that we're now in the middle of a golden age for documentary. What makes this so different, and therefore for me more exciting, is that so many people are working in different styles, different approaches to the documentary genre. So filmmakers recognising this as a period of significance, academics doing the same. So it kind of, this hunch that I'd had, I'd kind of witnessed. I wasn't the first to say it. People are kind of writing in the sort of the popular film magazines about this period. But looking back, yeah, something seems to be happening. By the time I start my study, apparently it's no longer in doubt. The New York Times cite that it's a commonly held belief that this is a golden age for documentary. So good, that felt like some vindication. Documentary is difficult to define academically, that's tough. Golden age, golden era, what do you do with that? I mean, there's no set test. There's no set test. We don't know when it started, we don't know when it ended, we don't know what the criteria might be. When does a period become a golden age? It's a tricky one. As a fan of film, I was kind of familiar with other golden ages, did some research. 1940s, 50s, the golden age of German cinema. 1950s, 1960s, the golden age of Japanese cinema. The crime thriller had its golden age in the 1970s. The 80s were the golden age of the great American action film. Hong Kong cinema underwent its golden age in the 1990s, and so on and so forth. And these were often categorized as being national golden ages or genre golden ages. So we've got a quite undefinable genre within a quite undefinable period that's taking place. And this is where my kind of research starts, if you like. It was to try to make sense with these two quite academically problematic, the genre and this period, really. As a filmmaker, it doesn't matter. You know, maybe there's extra funding as a result of this golden era. As a cinema goer, it doesn't really matter. Maybe there are more films. That's kind of what I argue at the end. You don't really need to engage with these quite difficult concepts. But as an academic studying this period, what I needed to do was to try and get something a bit more concrete. So against my kind of better wishes, I ended up researching something quite quantitative. And I'm not a maths person, but I've kind of become a maths person as a result of this research. Because it felt like that was, you know, if I was kind of building a case in a court, if I could cite tangible, quantitative data as part of proof that something happened, that felt that would be quite a compelling way of kind of framing my argument. So I did what ended up being a sizable portion of research, and I went back and looked at every film released in American cinemas from 1970 to 2009. And the reason I started at 1970 was because I got some fairly good quotes saying that prior to the 1950s, 1960s, there were very few feature-length documentaries released, and that was a nice cut-off point for me. It meant that I'd got enough decades to go back to give me some kind of a comparison. So I go back to 1970, and I look at every film released in American cinemas from my source, and I find out how many of those are documentaries. And during the entire decade, the number of feature-length documentaries released in American cinemas was 6 during that whole 10-year period. Now, I knew anecdotally that there were probably more than this that I'd seen in 2004, 2005, so that kind of seemed to suggest that maybe something had happened. And if we move on a decade, if we consider the 1980s, well, it increased, but it only increased by 2 during that whole decade. But it's an upward trend, okay? So it feels like we're on to something. And I knew in the 1990s that there were definitely a number of significant feature-length documentaries that had been released. I've referred to Hoop Dreams a moment ago. That's all about these 2 young basketball players. It followed them over 4 years, incredibly. The documentary crew followed them for 4 years as these young, aspiring NBA players faced all these trials and tribulations. I knew about Hoop Dreams. I'd heard of When We Were Kings, a brilliant archival documentary about Muhammad Ali fighting the rumble in the jungle, and I knew about this stuff. There was a high-grossing documentary called In Bed with Madonna. I saw that as a teenager and was massively, massively disappointed. I felt like I'd been missold, because in actual fact that documentary is all about her world tour. So I knew that there were some cinema documentaries that had been released in the 1990s. It felt like something's happening. So we got 6 in the 70s, 8 in the 80s. By the 90s, we had 43. Again, a sizable increase. And what it feels like we're getting is a bit of momentum. Quite a lot of these 43 were extreme sports docs. That kind of had a bit of became a bit of a trend in feature-length documentaries. Lots of snowboarding and skydiving documentaries, but also lots of kind of traditional pieces as well released. So we're kind of getting nearer. We're a few years away from when my interest first peaked. We've gone from kind of 6 to 8 to 43 to 557 the following decade. So that's the 70s just there. So statistically, quantifiably, it felt that yes, something had happened, and my interest kind of initially emerged kind of just almost halfway through that. So what we've got is this huge increase in documentaries. Number of possible causes, and in my study I look at causes. That's not kind of part of this presentation. A number of possible causes. You might have heard of the filmmaker Michael Moore, American documentary maker. He'd released a film in the 80s actually called Roger and Me, but his next significant documentary film was called Bowling for Columbine. released in 2002, looks at the 1999 Columbine High School Massacre. That became the highest grossing documentary ever released in America. Won him an Oscar. He gave a famous speech when he took his Oscar on stage, and he dedicated it to George Bush, the phony president who had just taken America into a phony war. So, national headlines. He then released another film, Fahrenheit 9/11, which obviously looks at the fallout of American foreign policy post September the 11th. That became the highest grossing documentary ever released in America. In fact, had it made half the money it made, it still would have been the highest grossing documentary ever made. 119 million. It was comparable with, there were big name documentaries, big name fictional films that didn't make as much as that one documentary did. So the critical and commercial success of his films, I think, is a massive part of it. If we think about this period I've just shown you here in terms of a line graph, this is a year-by-year increase or decrease in the number of documentaries released in American cinemas. And what we see is this peak of 97 films released in 1 year in 2008. So in 1 year, probably more than the combined total of every other year prior to that. So it felt like we were onto something here. Some statistical evidence to suggest that this was the case. It's a hard thing to prove. There'll be a multitude of factors as to what started this. New technology emerged, which kind of made documentaries cheaper to produce, easier to produce, cheaper to market. Franny Armstrong, British documentary maker, she attributes it squarely to Bowling for Columbine. All of a sudden there was more money being put into documentaries. They could be made relatively cheaply. They didn't involve expensive actors. They didn't involve expensive scriptwriters. No digital effects. So, having looked at the data we've looked at, the anecdotal evidence, which I could kind of bore you with more of, but we can kind of think of 2002 really as being the start of some kind of shift. And if I relocate to the UK, which is where the bulk of my study takes place, you're looking at the top 10 highest grossing documentaries released in British cinemas. Fahrenheit 9/11, 6.5 million, more than twice as much as the film in second place, Senna. Film you might be familiar with. March of the Penguins, French film you might be familiar with. Touching the Void, as I mentioned, Bowling for Columbine, the other Michael Moore film. All of them from 2002 onwards. Not a film in the top 10 or the top 20 highest grossing documentaries ever released in Britain that predates Bowling for Columbine. So again, it's all kind of evidence to suggest that this was a pivotal period. And if we look at, so this is the top 10 since, if you're interested in this as an update, since then, Senna, directed by a guy called Asaf Kapadia, since been beaten by Amy, the Amy Winehouse documentary, directed by Asaf Kapadia. So he's Michael Moore #1, he's got 2 and 3. I don't think anything will ever top Fahrenheit 9/11. It felt so of its time, and even people that weren't interested in documentaries were at least talking about this film. It became, at least for a while, a week or two, the big film to go and see. Very rare for a non-fiction film. This is a year-by-year indication of the number of films released in UK cinemas, and apart from 2007, when there was a 1-film reduction, we see this continuing year-on-year upward trend in the number of documentaries. It's hard to know whether it was supply or demand. Were more people watching films because more of them were being released? Were more being released because more people were watching them? That's almost impossible to pinpoint. But what we do get, quantifiable, this is BFI data here, which the BFI kindly publish this data yearly in these huge documents, and it's up to the researchers to trawl through and to find these figures. So that's, again, what I spent a large part of my time doing, quantifying it. The BFI think about films in terms of genres. Genre, of course, is just a way of categorizing things, really. You can think of films in lots of different ways. The nationalities, the directors, the stars, or also the genre type. 13 different cinematic genres recorded by the BFI during this period. Anyone tell me what's the most released genre, might you think, of all those genres? What do we see most of in UK cinemas? It's not documentary, I can tell you that. What types of films, what genre do we think we probably, even non-cinema goers might have a hunch?
Drama.
Pardon?
Drama?
Yeah, you're right, yeah. Kind of drama the most released? Thank you for shouting out. During this 10-year period, drama was the most released genre. Just over 1,400 dramas released during that time. But interestingly for my study, documentary, the 4th most released genre of film in British cinemas during this 10-year period. And more documentaries than horrors, thrillers, animations, crime, romance, biopics, adventure, music, dance, all sci-fi films. So again, just kind of adding weight to this, this notion which I'd kind of had, hopefully. What did it mean about UK-made documentaries? I've just talked about documentaries from all nationalities released in UK cinemas. Well, actually, this period, this golden age, whatever it was, this era of significance, had an relatively equal impact on the number of UK-made documentaries. Not too dissimilar an increase when we look at the UK-made one, a slight dip in 2005. So not only has this been good for the cinema goer, if you're a documentary fan, there's probably never been a better time. But if you're a UK documentary maker, it doesn't necessarily mean that more were being made, but certainly more were being released during this time. This similar slide shows the percentage of films which were released which were documentaries, UK-made films. And you can see that in 2012, just over 40% of all UK-made films released in the UK were documentaries. We are a nation of documentary makers, I would suggest. To summarise some of my results, audiences have never had such high access. Now, you might say, what about the figures before? Too short a time to include within this, had to hone in a little bit here. Documentaries have never attracted such high numbers. I don't think we'll ever get a $6 million box office like we had with Fahrenheit 9/11. There was something about that film, something about that time. 40% of UK-made documentaries, 40% of UK-made films were documentaries. What happened was, in 2005, documentary was the 7th most released genre. By the time we get to 2013, it became the most released. Considering the films, that's kind of where I started, so let's go back there. This wasn't just a time for cinema releases. New types of films were released, new types of documentaries. I talked before about the boundaries of the genre being pushed during this time. Cagalist tarnation and capturing the Freedmans as part of new documentaries which resisted the traditional approaches. Other films inviting us to question their structure, form, knowingly, very self-aware films which asked us to think about the boundaries between fiction and documentary film. Documentary superstars, films marketed in the way that fictional films may have been marketed, from the director who brought you. We got German director Werner Herzog, Americans Errol Morris, Scottish director Kevin MacDonald, Michael Moore, Morgan Spurlock. And even if you weren't a fan of documentaries, you probably heard about that film where that man just ate McDonald's for a month. This is the extent to which it entered kind of popular culture. I'm going to show you a modern equivalent, and this is quite a nice kind of indication of the extent to which documentary changed during a very, very short period. Again, this is a trailer. So you can imagine when Touching the Void was released, people said that's not a documentary, it contains far too much recreated footage. Skip 2012, and this is a film called The Act of Killing. I'll kind of let it speak for itself.
itu buatan orang yang menang. Saya pemenang. Yang saya harapkan ini tidak sampai begitu kali. Tapi sentuhan. Banyak ya manusia yang merasa apa dosa mas saya?
That's Killing received a general release in 2012. Rave reviews, award-winning film. But if just less than 10 years earlier Touching the Void had been problematic for the documentary genre, then this, which is a documentary about a fictitious film which recreates historical events, whatever you thought about documentary no longer applies to this yet. It's been one of the most revered documentaries of recent times. So we're talking about a period when the genre underwent a significant number of releases, huge changes in the types of films. I've got kind of more examples I might show you here. And different ways in which the documentary might be researched, assembled, digital documentaries, iDocs, as they've been dubbed, emerging during this period. Various other films I might refer to here, The Act of Killing being one of those, a new breed of unruly artivist films. So just to conclude, where might I go from here, having established something of significance in terms of the releases and the types of films, the new trends that emerged, the new genres which came into existence? Well, there's, I think, room for exploration into see whether this kind of golden age, golden era, did it occur in other nationalities, other parts of the world as well. We can look in more detail at this impact of digital technology. Many of these films were highly cinematic in their structure. I could have shown you other examples of films which are created with twists in the tale. The Imposter you might be familiar with. As good a twist as any fictional film you've ever seen. An exploration into the politics of the time. Many of these films were of their age in that they were kind of looking at American politics, post 9/11, climate change issues and the like, or also issues about how the films were funded or marketed during this time. Has the bubble burst? It's bursting, I think. Netflix, I think, will probably be the platform for these types of programs. More and more documentaries on Netflix. Sundance Film Festival is where most of these films are bought. At the last Sundance Film Festival, the biggest buyers of documentary, feature-length documentary, were Amazon and Netflix. So that might become the platform. Michael Moore, the flag bearer for documentary during this period, his last film, Where to Invade Next, his biggest flop yet. Apparently he was approached by Netflix to release it digitally. He said, no, my films were made for the cinema. Nobody went to see them. Has the bubble burst? Should it be considered a golden age? Does it represent a new movement in cinema? Will be the next stage of my research. Thank you very much. Well, I'm gladly taking any questions. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, the point you made right at the end, does this constitute a new movement in cinema? I wonder whether are you observing a movement in cinema, or are you observing a movement in the way film is consumed? Because the fact that documentaries are going to move to Netflix and Amazon is a general. I mean, there is a general trend towards that kind of movement, isn't there, about the way people consume things?
Yeah.
And I suppose all genres will follow the crowd in that respect. I wonder whether you looked at an earlier point, in the 90s, for example, like how many documentaries were actually being made compared to how many were being made in 2000s, irrespective of where they were being published.
That's when it becomes always impossible to find out. So there are records of films which are being released, and it might only be released in one cinema for one weekend, but it's been open to the paying public for a period. So the BFI can record that, and the BBFC to some extent can as well through their rating process. In terms of the number being made, that's when it becomes even more undefinable. who records it, what constitutes it, when does a short film become a feature-length film. I would love to know whether the number of documentaries being made increased. I would probably say, if I had to hedge my bets, that yes, but I just can't say it. There's not a source I can cite, there's not a place I can go to. It feels as if more are being released, therefore logic would say that more were being made to service that demand. Most of them were kind of made during this period. It's not as if they suddenly bought up many from previous years, previous decades. It's unfindable would be, or you know, if you've got any suggestions as to where I might get that data, but it's just, this felt like a clean way of you know, a respectable, citable source to demonstrate what I thought was the case. As for how many being made, who knows? And then your other point about the Netflix thing, annoyingly, Netflix don't release their viewing figures. You don't get that. They're very coy about it. They'll tell you how many subscribers they've got in a region or in a country. They won't ever tell you how many people watch these things. So yeah, we might, you know, we've kind of stepped out of the shadows into the light briefly, but we might just be returning to the shadows when, you know, this stuff just becomes, yeah, unprovable or undefinable. Yeah.
Do you think there's like a bit of a crossover between sort of cinema that's not documentary and documentary, because there's a growing trend in cinema in general on focusing on stories that are about true stories and people that have existed? Do you think that there's something like a trend overall that's meant this, or do you think it's cinema that's influenced documentary, or films that aren't documentary have influenced documentary, and that's why it's grown, or do you think documentaries influenced other kinds of cinema instead?
There's definitely a huge appetite for true life stories based on real life events. We only need to look at the films that are nominated or win the Oscar. Invariably, they are a well-known actor doing an impression of a real person that did something of significance. And so there's a real appetite for real life stories. One of the things I found most problematic in my research was, you know, when does Dallas Buyers Club, an event about a film about an actual person that actually existed, when does that, you know, cease to be a fictional film? Why can't I argue that that's just a highly recreated documentary? And it was really hard for me to kind of distinguish those two things for a long time. I think what a fictional film based on real life can do, I think the distinction is what a fictional film can do that a documentary can't. So the Dallas Buyers Club, I don't know if you're familiar with that film, the character played by Jared Leto that he won an Oscar for didn't exist in real life. The character Ray doesn't exist, created for the film. In actual fact, I read quite recently that the character himself never did rodeo, yet the first thing you see him doing at the start of the film, he's a rodeo rider. So you can do that in fictional film inspired by real life events. You can kind of take the essence of something, add on something more to make the story fuller, richer. You can't do that in documentary. I think that's the main distinction. In a documentary, you can edit it, you can add music, you can cut to close-ups. Michael Moore can introduce some polemical thing that he thinks about George Bush, but he can't just invent a person in the way that fictional film can. So there's a massive appetite. You did get a crossover. You almost got like, you know, you got some films which were clearly fictional, which pretended to be documentaries. Cloverfield was one of those kind of found footage type films where we saw this kind of shaky cam footage. The person filming it was one of the characters in the film. It was completely fictional. It was a monster movie, Cloverfield, but it took on the aesthetical traits of a documentary. So on one hand, you've got documentaries becoming more cinematic, more fiction-like. On the other hand, you've got fiction films exhibiting lots of traits for documentaries. Even films which didn't have that found footage kind of conceit. The Jason Bourne films, the last two Jason Bourne films, have a kind of a cinematic look about them. They were filmed by Paul Greengrass, a British director who kind of rose through the TV documentary ranks, kind of World in Action on ITN and stuff like that. If you look at those films now, shot at distance, long lens, lots of shaky, following the action. It gives us a sort of heightened sense of realism because we associate that with real life. We associate it with news footage being grabbed on the scene before the thing disappears. We associate that with documentary stuff where you can't just say, okay, can we do that again, take two, because the moment's gone. So films became increasingly non-fictionalised. So yeah, you did get this real overlap during that time. Yeah, Sarah?
Yeah.
You talked about, or you investigated the trend of feature documentaries shown in cinemas.
Yes.
So, do you have any idea? Because I'm also interested in documentaries done by journalists for news outlets. Do you have any idea about the trends, the journalistic documentaries?
No, I don't actually. And the difficulty here has been like slavishly positioning this research in feature-length cinema documentaries. Now, some of the filmmakers I've referred to here were journalists, and they've kind of made that transition into feature-length. But no, it becomes, I don't have the answer, and it's a kind of, it's an extension of the research which would be fascinating, but if I allowed it to kind of move in that direction, then equally I'd need it to move in that direction as well. So no, I don't know. I'm sure it would feel like there would be an increase, but no, I'd be interested to know if that was the case. Yeah?
Two-part question. One, I want to go back to this kind of conceptual idea of what separates documentary and fiction. How do you reconcile what people share with a definition like that? Because it's completely animated, you see no human beings on screen.
No.
Like, theoretically, how do you get around that?
Really difficult, really. So if you're looking at a subject retrospectively, you have to have something to put on the screen. Now, traditionally, they might have used archive footage. They're talking about Gillingham in the 50s. Here's some shots of Gillingham in the 50s. It might not necessarily relate to the subject, but it's near enough to be an accompaniment, something for you to look at whilst you're listening to the information. Archival footage is a very kind of traditional approach. What you kind of got during this period, lots of really creative ways of filling that gap through animation. You might have seen the Kurt Cobain documentary montage of Heck, where it animates the singer Kurt Cobain, the Nirvana lead singer. It animates drawings that he did to accompany the documentary, to fill in those gaps. It's problematic, you know, whether it's recreated with actors like Touching the Void or The Imposter, or whether it's recreated through animation, whether it's difficult. And I think the only thing, sometimes the thread connecting a documentary to real life, it might just be a single thread because it's been completely animated. But at least it exists. It's enough of a link to distinguish it from. It's hard. Yeah. At what point does it cease to be that and crossover? Yeah. Who knows? But yeah, good example. Did you have part two?
Yeah, part two. And because you've been looking at the US and the UK, and this is more, I think, a personal opinion of your own, because it's not necessarily what your research is looking at. Do you think in the UK there's a particular breeding ground for this kind of filmmaking because you have the BBC? And because it's state funded and it outsources the making of a lot of documentaries, we might not necessarily get like full screen releases, but that's a breeding ground for people to then go on and do their own full length, versus the US where they don't necessarily have that model.
I don't know the answer. I can't say yes. I would feel like it is yes. And there are other organisations. Channel 4 mostly fund an organisation called BritDocs, which even if they don't make or distribute your film, can be involved in its production. You might have encountered a documentary distributor called Dogwoof as well, which just exists to distribute documentaries. It would feel like that would be the case. I don't know to what extent these. I mean, Kevin MacDonald definitely came through the BBC. He's our kind of, preeminent documentary maker, our Michael Moore, if you like. But it's not as if that's the natural extension of telly is to go to film, because quite often these people have come from a fictional film basis and then kind of moved into it. So I don't know whether it makes it any more accessible or as a result of it, but it would feel like that would be the case. Someone else told me that the reason that there's really good wildlife documentaries in the US, really big budget ones, is because we have the BBC, which services that need through Attenborough and through Wildlife on One. And obviously that stuff gets sold to the US as well. But the reason March of the Penguins was so successful, well, actually, you'd seen those types of things on British television before. So I think, yeah, the nationalities do, to some extent, dictate what's shown. Mina?
I was wondering, don't you think the fact that some documentaries are marketed like blockbusters, like when you see those trailers with love, it's really surprising and there's a lot of suspense. Isn't it a bit weird or like kind of unhealthy, because the value of documentary should be the information it's bringing to people? I mean, their main aim is to bring information and not like to be like a blockbuster or like Fast and Furious like type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So isn't it a bit weird that they're using the same marketing as we got?
I guess the marketing, you only get short, you've got 90-second trailer. It's about emphasising an aspect of the film. So if you want to emphasise the highly dramatic, the highly tense moments within the film in 90 seconds, you can. Yes, these films need to be informative, and I know more about mountaineering, climbing the Suv Le Grand as a result of watching Touching the Void, but they also need to be entertaining. They also need to be a yarn. They also need to be escapist. Some films are constructed as thrillers, even though they're documentaries. If you've watched a film called Searching for Sugar Man, there's a real twist in that film. The Imposter, when I saw that in the cinema, there was an audible gasp in the cinema, and I won't tell you what the twist was. So sometimes, I know what you mean, like, is it inauthentic, I guess, to kind of suggest they're one thing when really they're something else, but sometimes they are specifically made to be, you know, edge-of-your-seat thrillers. And the end of Spellbound, you know, track it down, it's well worth watching. It is as exciting to see who wins that spelling competition in 1999, which I know is a long time ago now, as any Fast and Furious film, which I've watched all 7, but it's as exciting to see, you know, real life doesn't have to be bland and pedestrian, it can be just as fun.
Yeah, but they could put forward the fact that, for example, there is digging the for Spellbound, for example, we could put forward the fact that they're really digging the whole world of spelling bees and that they're investigating real people who have done, like, taking into those competitions, and instead they're saying like the whole ending is the thrill of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, it makes like the most important part, which is going into the reality of those people, is kind of hidden between the fact that there's a big
yeah, I take your point, but I guess if someone says to me, how was your day, I'll give them the high points. You know, the stuff that the most memorable, interesting, entertaining, boring, you know, whatever. It's very rare that I'll kind of give them all the in-between bits, which I probably can't even remember by the time I get home. But no, it's a fair point, but I guess you're limited in 90 seconds as to what you can do. And if, you know, marketing is about selling, that's when it stops being an art and becomes a business, and it's about getting those bums on the seats. And if they think the best way of doing that is to craft an intro this way, shall I make that the last one, or how much time?
I think you're right.
Oh,
as well.
Sorry, mate. Yeah.
No, I can chat with you. Go for it.
No, I was on a question between the distinction between a journalist and a director. What sort of, because there are, I mean, obviously stuff on TV that's produced by journalists, but there are films, I don't know, like Citizen 4 or other films that are done journalistically, but also made it onto the big screen.
Yeah.
What's the distinction between a director sort of and journalism? Sort of,
yeah, I imagine. I mean, if you said to Laura Poitras, "What are you?" she'd say, "I'm a filmmaker." Probably, yeah. Michael Moore gave a brilliant speech in Toronto in 2011, where he said, "We need to stop thinking of ourselves as documentarians." Martin Scorsese doesn't call himself a fictionarian. We're filmmakers. You know, the medium's irrelevant, really. We make stuff to be seen on the big screen. Yeah, I mean, journalism is ultimately storytelling, the conveyance of information. This happened, these people were involved, and whether you replicate that with a printing press or with a film camera, it's essentially about the characters, the stories, the events. So yeah, it's a tough one. Yeah, I don't know what they would say that they are. Yeah.